Okay, if you move over to these two tables, you'll be able to get a handout that is a part of this session. So that's an inducement for those of you on the far tables to do something like move. And I'm going to leave a few more copies on your table, thinking that there may be some people down there. You'll need to move down here to get a handout. If that's not enough of an inducement, then I don't know what to say. Goodness, another one.
Come from afar.
Okay, but please don't go back to the far.
And today I have another friend I'm plugged in right now. It's charging.
Okay.
But I'll speak.
Okay, thanks. You've moved to these two sections. I really appreciate it. If you would do that, I would be extremely happy. But if you don't hand them out past the I'm pretty good. Okay, here we go. Thanks. And there's probably going to be extras. I don't know. Maybe. I'm not sure how many ran. I think there'll be extras for the next session. Hopefully. This workshop will begin in 2 minutes, just so you have a little bit of warning as to what to expect. And if you're in this session, please be sure you receive a copy of the handout. Of course. Handouts are in these two sections going around, so if you don't have one, you should be able to find one on one of these two tables. But stay at these two tables if you can, just so it'll keep us a little more proximate to the presentation area. Thank you for being cooperative, those of you who have been, or who are.
I think everybody got some. These have already been handed out, and there were extras, so you're good.
Okay, yeah, if you didn't get a handout, just pick one up here, okay? And remember, these are posted also, so, the actual slides will be posted. You have a website where you can go to get those slides. That will be, I think, to your advantage. This is one of the handouts, however, that we're going to take a little bit closer look at, and so I thought you're having a copy of it in front of you would be good, a hard copy, as opposed to just the slide copy that you'll be able to see. It'll save you a little bit in terms of being able to deal with. This session is based on 10 years of my work with evaluating gifted programs across 6 states on the East Coast, including New Jersey, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida. I think that's 6. Strong gifted programs in all of those 6 states. These aren't programs that are weak. They're probably among the strongest. I'd say they're definitely in the top 20% nationally, every single one that I evaluated. So the findings that came out of this study, these studies, 10 different studies, suggest to me that there are some fundamental issues that we need to be concerned about in terms of both evaluating gifted programs, but also in developing gifted programs. So in terms of the backdrop for this session, that's really where it's coming from. And you'll see as I go through, I'll be talking about some of the processes of evaluation, but I'll also talk about the results. What did we find? I'm going to end the presentation with 2 basic slides. One slide that says what doesn't work in terms of trying to find out what works in gifted programs and how to improve gifted programs. We know what doesn't work. We also know what does work. And so the last slide is what does work. And I want you to have a feel for how that goes, okay? I love this slide because it's a picture that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even today, we suffer from in too many school districts. The gifted program is tied up with one person who is usually a wonder woman as opposed to a wonder man, because they're elementary programs for the most part, who has kept the program together for years. And then something happens. She leaves. And when she leaves, there is no follow-up. There's no follow-up because the program has been centered in one person. And so that person leaves, we have no program. This is the kind of thing when you're thinking about developing a gifted program, running a gifted program, expanding a gifted program, you always have to be conscious of who is the leadership and how will this program continue, which means it suggests you need to have groups of people, stakeholders, deeply involved with ensuring the continuity of a gifted program. So it's an important lesson, I think, in terms of where we get started. A second point that I think is important is to how you then go about evaluation. If you say that the reason we're evaluating a gifted program is to try to make it better, is to try to improve what we are, that kind of issue. Evaluation is not to put down a program or to say this is rotten, let's get rid of it. It's to say, how can we get better? How can we make this stronger than it is? Which means every program should always be evaluated. It's part of program development. It's not separate from it. It's actually, in some respects, the first step, or one of the first steps, in terms of setting up programs, is to have an evaluation design for those programs from the beginning, not at the end. Secondly, we have to be very clear it's a collaborative process. It's not just the coordinator who has to be concerned about this, or the principal. It's everybody who's involved with the program. So the teachers are a collaborative group in this, collaborative group of stakeholders, parents are, kids are. So thinking about an evaluation in that way helps you to both broaden the engagement of people, but it also allows you to bring in their thoughts, their ideas, their criticisms in ways that often don't come out in an appropriate way unless you're systematically engaging them. The third, and I'll come back to this because it's in one of the final things that we know, is that you've got to use multiple data sources. Too often, when we decide how are students doing in a gifted program, what we look at is how have they done on their state test, okay? Have they ended up in the top 20% on their state test? Well, does that tell us very much about the gifted program? No, and especially if it's a part-time program, which most programs are, it tells us very little. We can't separate out. Did this happen because of the gifted program? Did it happen because of the regular classroom program? So we have to be sure we're using multiple data sources at every level to make decisions about what's working or not what's working in a gifted program. Which means a lot of people like to take surveys every year. They have to send them to their stakeholder groups. Let's give parents a chance to give us some feedback. Let's give the kids a chance to give us some feedback. Okay, those are two stakeholder groups, but that's one source of data. And it's a very soft form of data, in terms of what you're getting back. Not enough to make decisions about program change. Enough to have a sense of the satisfaction with the existing program, but not enough to really say what's working, what's not, and how can we potentially make changes. So if we really want to make our program stronger, then we have to say getting satisfaction survey data is insufficient. You can have good satisfaction and have a lousy program. Because in general, this has been my experience over 50 years of evaluating gifted programs, is that parents and kids are likely to give you more positive results than you deserve, okay? And part of it is because the kids like their teacher and they like what they're doing, but they may not have good enough insights into what they're doing to really have good judgments all the way around. And parents often don't know enough, especially about the curriculum. So they'll be positive because they want to keep the program going. So you've got some built-in bias in terms of those two groups when you're getting back these satisfaction surveys. So that's my rationale here, to think about this in a broader fashion using those three fundamental ideas and beliefs as a way to do it. This little model, I don't know if it's helpful or not. It's always been helpful to me. I like graphics and I like to be able to see how things that are being said kind of fit together conceptually. So when I think about looking at an evaluation, you really start with the planning of your program or your curriculum. And then you move to actually implementing it, which for teachers means instruction in the classroom. And then you study it. That's what evaluation and assessment are all about. You study what's happening after I've done this stuff. What does it matter? And then finally, after an evaluation, you have improvement. You act. And then the cycle continues. So I think of this as an annual way to think, if you're a classroom teacher, about your whole notion of evaluating gifted student performance, evaluating your effectiveness, evaluating how the overall program is functioning. You can get a lot of information if you just keep that little cycle in mind and keep it going. The hardest part for teachers, and I understand this, was a classroom teacher for 7.5 years before I went into administering programs for the gifted. I always found that it was hard for me to make the connect between instruction and studying, because I never had enough time to always do the studying to the extent necessary in order to really make improvements. So I think if you're a teacher, you have to build in the time. You have to say, this is important, and this is how it's going to go forward. So in your plans, in your whole idea about planning for instruction, that studying part has to be there. Sitting down with your colleagues on how your kids are doing in the gifted program, and what's the evidence I have that they're doing well, or that they're not doing so well. Or sitting down and discussing outlier kids, like, I'll think of her name any minute now, our keynote speaker who was just sitting here, Sylvia, who she was just talking about, these underachievers. Those are kind of outlier kids. There's always things to say about them because they're not, responding in the way you would hope they would. To have discussions about those kinds of kids and what can be happening in instruction that isn't for them. So there's lots of ways to think about that study piece. Don't have to do it always individually, but doing it systematically as a part of what you do in the gifted program. So you all mostly, meet, I assume, if you're in working in teams with other teachers who work with gifted learners at different stages of development, to put aside some planning time that focus on your outlier groups and how they're doing in the program. Or your kids who are from low-income backgrounds, minority backgrounds, students of color, students who are often not identified for gifted programs, but when they are, really need to be looked at because they're potential kids who could drop out too easily if they're overlooked. So the issue of interventions for them is a really critical one as you go through the program and work it. So those are just some issues, I think, that you need to consider. Most evaluations begin with questions, and they should. They always do if you have an outside evaluator at work for you, but even internally. There are questions every year you should be answering about your gifted program. I've listed here 3 that are pretty common. The first, to what extent are the stated mission and goals of the gifted program fulfilled in their actual operation? In other words, if you have a goal of developing critical thinking in gifted students, K-8, 3-8, 4-8, 6-8, whatever it happens to be, in what ways is critical thinking being addressed and developed? What's the evidence you have each year that that's happening? Okay, that's an example of what's meant by that first question. Okay, and that would be true for whatever your goals are. I just gave that as an example. The second, to what extent is the gifted program meeting the needs of identified students as perceived by relevant stakeholder groups? Okay, this is where you get to the stakeholder group idea. And I like to do focus groups myself rather than surveys, because then you can talk to people, you can do follow-up probing questions, you can do it in small groups, and it's a very efficient way to be able to get feedback from those stakeholder groups. But you want more than parents and kids. You want your principals and other administrators who are involved in the program. You want your teachers. And both the teachers who work with gifted kids and the teachers who don't. That is, the specialized teachers of the gifted and your regular classroom teachers who have them, but don't have them necessarily for the specialty areas in gifted. Those are all important groups to figure out how the program is perceived, okay? And this is just your part of it is PR, but part of it is also to be able to give you a sense of what's getting through about this program. What do parents understand and what don't they understand? And what does that imply in terms of what we ought to be doing with parent education? What do other teachers understand or not understand? And what does that say about the professional development approaches that we should be using with those teachers? Okay? So you get a lot of information from evaluation about future professional development. Okay? So that's another reason that question is so important. Thirdly, what evidence exists to document positive student performance trends for students participating in gifted programs? Okay? This is a loaded question. But I like for teachers to think about it, if you just think about it from your own classroom and what you can do in a given year to collect some data on how your students are doing above and beyond what those state test scores say. Because the state test scores, again, are on grade level information. They're not information that really tells you about higher level functioning and the extent to which these students are engaging in higher level problem solving, critical thinking, creative thinking, research abilities. All of those things aren't assessed on those measures. So that's an important kind of thing to be looking at if you're at the teacher level. We're also interested if if you have a goal in a gifted program that's to develop critical thinking, you probably need to use at some point a critical thinking scale. Maybe not every single year, but you have a pre-assessment on critical thinking, and then maybe 2 years later you have a post-assessment or a midpoint assessment, and then 2 years later another one. So you can see what's the developmental trend here. Are our kids getting stronger in critical thinking? And are they getting stronger every year that they're in a gifted program that says that that's the goal? Okay? That's another way to think about student performance. Another way we have often used in our evaluations is to look at advanced placement scores and participation rates, and IB scores and participation rates, or Cambridge scores and participation rates, depending on what those secondary programs, hallmark programs are, that school districts actually run. How are gifted students doing in them? An expectation for gifted learners, if you have an AP program in your district, is that they would have taken at least 3 AP courses by the time they graduated from high school. How many of your gifted kids are? Well, we find in many school districts it's a much lower number than you would expect. And these are often districts that don't have alternatives like IB, or like the Cambridge program, or even that don't participate widely in dual enrollment, all of which are legitimate options at that stage, but we don't know, how things are going. Because AP and IB are so transparent in terms of curricular expectations, outcome expectations, and the assessment processes that are used in terms of the scoring, it does give you a pretty good indicator of how your gifted kids are doing in advanced college level material. Much better, I would argue, than dual enrollment. Dual enrollment is all over the place in terms of what's going on curricularly, with how the assessment has been judged. We just know that in half of the states in this country, it's automatically accepted as college credit if the student goes to a public university. But for purposes of improving our programs at K-12, we don't get back data that are helpful in terms of doing that. So that's why I focus on AP, not because it's the only thing out there, but it's one of the major things that's out there that will give you that information and allows you to back map from there, If you don't have what you would expect with your gifted kids, they should all be receiving 3s, 4s, or 5s on the 3 advanced placement courses that they've taken. That would be the standard, let's say. How many of your gifted kids annually aren't meeting that standard? That's then a cause for concern if that's not happening. So that gives you another way to look at the data and to think about it. These are data every district has, or you can get a hold of through your AP coordinator, okay? All comes into the district. It can be looked at typically and parsed by identified gifted student population who have taken AP versus those who have not. If you don't have a system that allows you to do that, probably would be wise to try to institute one if you could. Okay. All right, then I said there one other thing, other questions of interest. Most evaluations have, and many times, at least 5 questions, sometimes 6. So as you're thinking about your evaluation of gifted programs, what other things are you interested in other than these 3 questions? Are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? What do people think about what you're doing? And what do we know about student learning? Okay? Those are the 3 questions that lie behind this more sophisticated set of questions you see here. But what other things are you interested in? This is a real question, by the way, not rhetorical.
Identifying students, accurately identifying.
Okay, good. Identification has remained the bugaboo in this field. I've been in it for 55 years, and I have never seen it go away as an issue. It'll probably always be with us because it's an imperfect system, and it always will be. But it is an important question. And if in your district, as many districts have trouble with, the identification of underrepresented populations, low-income students, students of color, students of poverty, and twice exceptional, the group that was talked about this morning. Those 4 groups are often underrepresented in gifted programs. So the question is, how are those groups being included? That's often a secondary question related to what this gentleman, Matt, has said in terms of what he wants to know about identification. Because that's really, people want to know what is the model identification approaches that we could be using, and how will that identification model improve what we're doing now. Now, one of the underlying questions there is, what are you doing now? And what is it yielding? So, for example, you think that you're doing things that have been recommended in the literature, like using a nonverbal test, like the Naglieri, or using a nonverbal, verbal, and mathematical test that gives you good domain-specific scores, like the Lohmann's test, cognitive abilities test. Those are all both recommended strongly in the literature. But if you aren't looking as to how those tests are working for you, are they doing what you think they should be doing? That's a fabulous follow-up to this whole issue of getting in place a really good identification protocol. Thank you for sharing that. It's a wonderful question. I've seen it out of the evaluations that this presentation is based on. I've seen that be an issue in every single district. Every single district. Okay, yes?
Well, we're trying to figure out how to measure them more qualitatively, because we have a lot of quantitative measures in place.
Mm-hmm.
We're afraid we're missing kids because we don't have a strong qualitative measure.
Okay, so how do you look at the performance of gifted students in both quantitative and qualitative ways? Okay, I've got a whole list of suggestions on this presentation, so I'll say more about it as we go through. But it's a very good question, and it's a very good thing to be thinking about, to be sure that, you know, when I talk about multiple data sources, one of the things that we're not using enough are these quantitative and qualitative measures to really see how gifted students are learning. And it's the combination of those measures, I think, that is the most effective for really understanding the performance of a child. Particularly for individual students, many of whom are very good in a specific area, and you want to really be able to showcase that in some way. It's a really powerful way to do that. So, good question. Yes?
How to support the gifted students in the regular education classroom. I find that that's how my district struggles. You know, they go to their programs, but then when they're back in the classrooms for a large portion of their day, how to support those teachers in providing what they need.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be a teacher in today's schools. I'm sorry to say that, but I wouldn't want to be. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do what you guys do all the time. I think I was an effective teacher. I think I was more effective with gifted kids than I was with any other group that I ever worked with, and I worked with all groups, you know, when I taught. But I think today, gifted education teachers in particular are asked to do everything and be everything. And I just want you to know that I think that that's really hard. And so I think you always have to make choices in terms of what you can do, you know, respectively. It may be in your job description. You're supposed to teach gifted kids so many minutes a week. You're supposed to work with teachers so many minutes a week. You're supposed to work with your specialists in a collaborative way so many minutes a week. Okay, that looks good on paper, but how do you actually make it happen, you know? And what's the model for making it happen? Again, it's a great question. It's one that I think is haunting a lot of school districts right now in terms of how to make those connections. If the school district is willing to do pull-out or specialized programs outside the classroom, then how do we make sure that the regular classroom teachers are adequately prepared to allow those students to, first of all, continue on with their gifted work in the areas of their exceptionality, at the same time working with them effectively in the regular classroom. It's a dilemma, and it is one that I think every coordinator of gifted programs has to be concerned about. You know, what is it that is the nature of the training program for regular classroom teachers so that they know enough about gifted kids to be able to handle them in the regular classroom? What kind of collaborative structures could be put in place to make that work for the expertise of the gifted teacher to be utilized efficiently? What I see too often is an inefficient use of gifted teachers' time in terms of, you know, working in the regular classroom. What tends to happen is that in many of these situations, the time on task with gifted students gets eroded, and the decision becomes more time with the regular classroom teacher is better, the so-called push-in model, than is working with those gifted students directly, either one-on-one or in small groups. I think you have to be very careful about bridging those two things. The time, the majority of the time, should still be devoted to gifted students themselves. That's the frontline job. You know, we have gifted programs for gifted students, not for teachers who don't know about gifted students, okay? So the job description is critical here. We have instructional coaches in schools, part of whose time could be devoted to working with regular classroom teachers on use of advanced materials in all the core subject areas. Many literacy specialists are quite willing to work with kids who have advanced literacy skills, who are ready for critical reading, many times right away from kindergarten. Those instructional coaches can go into regular classrooms. That's their job, to work with teachers in terms of different levels of learners. The RTI model isn't just for special education students, it's also for gifted students. So the literacy piece can become a part of how this piece of the gifted program gets delivered. Same way with the STEM support structures that are in school. Those people also can learn individually as coaches what are some of the pieces of the STEM program that are particularly rich for gifted students, and how can we support teachers in terms of implementing those. So I think that we need to look to the other resources that are already available in the school and see some of those resource people retrained to be sure that gifted is a part of the job description. After all, gifted kids are a part of the overall school population. So all classroom teachers should be trained at least in, if they don't know how to do it themselves, who can they get to help them and who has that expertise. And it isn't always the teacher of the gifted. Could be these content specialists, because that's where most gifted kids need help from the very beginning. If they're advanced in literacy, they need somebody with that kind of background to really work with them. If they're advanced in math, they need a math specialist. If they're crazy about science, they need a science specialist. So use your content specialists and also think about them in those ways. I'm kind of giving advice immediately, and I hope that's okay. What happened to the presentation? It went away. Okay, 3 great additional questions. I hope you've made a note of them, but I've had some commentary about each of them that I hope will be helpful as well. Now, when I talk about data, and I say it's important that you look at multiple data sources to find out about your program, this is what I mean about multiple data sources, on which several of these can be used for any of the given questions, okay? So it's not like you're matching just one up against the questions we just looked at, but you might look at several of these, okay? So if you want to get a look at how well your program is being implemented in the classroom, what do you think would be the most important data sources to look at to answer that question? Which is part of, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing kind of thing? What data sources are going to help you with that? Yes?
It's a trick question, it's all of them.
Okay, could very well be all of them. However, not every district wants to spend the time to go through a full-scale evaluation every year. And I don't always recommend it, in fact. I'd rather see you on an annual basis, pick out a couple of them maybe, and then every 5 years do a full-scale evaluation, have somebody come in from the outside and do it. But you've got to learn to kind of do some of these things yourself as a part of the program development, so it's not a cost issue, but it's something you can really do. Yes, sir?
So one thing I'm very interested in terms of the student impact data is
Yes.
looking at student work that's produced through the program. But the problem that, and perhaps you have some advice for us on this, is the problem is that the work is so different. What we might see students produce, and it's very individualized. So what someone might produce in 8th grade looks dramatically different than what someone might produce in 3rd grade.
You would hope so.
So are there, either we can go and create our own sort of rubric or assessment of work process, but what would you recommend in terms of figuring that out?
Yes, if you want to rely substantially on product data, I think it's better to standardize your rubrics and standardize your task demands, okay? So that, for example, writing assessments are a wonderful example of this sort of approach. You can have a standard task demand for writing that's given at the beginning of the program, and maybe given every year in the program, and maybe in between, every quarter there is an example of student writing that is assessed on a common rubric. I'm giving you a rubric actually that's included in all of our William & Mary units for looking at writing. It's a writing assessment, can be used all the way up from kindergarten through grade 12. So you don't have to change rubrics. This is a problem because we've gone rubric crazy. That's wonderful if teachers know how to create rubrics. Well, it is and it isn't. It's good in terms of individual, very targeted assignments or projects, that you might have with your kids where you have to change the rubric because of the nature of the project. You can't just have a common one, or it's more difficult to. But on the other hand, if you want to use these data in a systematic way, then you've got to use a common rubric. And you've got to decide, are you going to do a writing assessment? Are you going to do a project assessment? Are you going to do a presentation assessment? What kinds of products do you really want to be looking at that students are capable of doing, okay? And then once you know that, you need the task demand, and then you need the rubric that goes with the task demand, but it has to be, again, a common one. My recommendation always on this is to look first in the literature. Is there stuff out there that's been used? My answer to you is yes. All the William and Mary curriculum materials have performance-based data for gifted students that have been tried and used in a number of gifted programs. This is in literature, it's in social studies, it's in math, it's in science. And there are also some standardized measures outside of that that also would work with this more qualitative data. And I'll try to make some suggestions. There's more in the handout that you'll see as we go through related to that. It relates back to the question of looking at qualitative assessment data in addition to quantitative assessment data. But even with qualitative data, you've got to have some standards in place that will allow you to look at the qualitative data. For example, AP programs, many of them, it's a very qualitative assessment that's employed. Yet, it can be transformed into a quantitative form, which makes it then easy to interpret, easy to understand, and easy to use for program improvement. It's the same issue here that he's raising. So, very good. Any other comments on these data sources? Yes?
I'm wondering, in response to his question, is it ever appropriate for some of these things to be combined? So for example, if you want to look at student work, could it be combined with focus groups? So the student has work and then the same questions are asked of the student, maybe the student and parent. So that's kind of regularized. The same questions are asked when the student looks at their work and talks about their learning. And then you wouldn't have to have such a structured type of assignment or scoring basis, but you would be able to maybe tease out some specific information about how the assignments are guiding student learning.
Well, if you're suggesting, should there be common questions asked about the work or common conversational tools to get at the individual product, I would say yes, that would be good. But again, it depends on how individualized you want to, craft this as opposed to a more group-oriented approach. Patterson School District, for example, here in New Jersey, that's running a gifted program for kids from low-income minority backgrounds from grades 2 through 8, do portfolios of work, and they have a set of common things that are included in those portfolios, common questions that they use with the kids in terms of how to integrate their understanding of different subject areas across. So that's an example, and then they sit down with parents and have the kids share what they've done in at the end of a given quarter or the end of a given half year, and then discuss what comes off of that. But there is a common template, is my point, and that's an important part. You've got to retain that. It can't be so individualized that there can be no comparative judgment made relative to either the level of the work that's going on or the quality of the product that emerges out of that work. Both of those things are important. Okay. Anything else on the data sources? We're going to talk about these a little bit in greater detail anyway, in terms of some of the further slides. So when we look at this issue of how do you know that gifted students in your classroom, your school, or your district are making appropriate achievement gains, what do you guys use now? Other than the New Jersey state test. What do you use to know, are your kids learning or not? What do you use? Just in your own classroom, what do you look at? Yeah.
We do Ames Web assessments 3 times a year and track the rate of growth throughout the year, the rate of improvement.
I'm sorry, what's the assessment?
Ames Web.
Ames Web. Okay, I'm not familiar with that as an assessment tool. Is it geared to gifted learners per se?
No, it's
okay.
for everyone.
All right. The issue becomes right away, you got to be careful in terms of spending a lot of time on assessments that are on grade level based. If they're on grade level assessments, they're not going to be that helpful in terms of getting at the more advanced behaviors that you want to find that your gifted students are experiencing. So you want to look at the assessment carefully, and you want to review it in light of what it has and what it doesn't have. Sometimes parts of assessments are useful, but sometimes the majority of assessment is not. And a lot of time can be spent in terms of using those. Many of times those are used to get kids, for struggling learners, to get them up to the level where they'll pass the New Jersey test. That is not the kind of assessment that's going to be useful in terms of tracking gifted student performance in general. Because I don't know that assessment, I can't speak to it specifically, but
we don't look at the score of that assessment, we look at the rate of improvement throughout the year.
yes, but if a student is starting at a high point, where's he going to score on a midpoint assessment? He might even go down. Does that mean that a gifted student isn't gifted and shouldn't be getting advanced instruction? No, it just means you're using the incorrect type of assessment to make judgments about how well that student has learned certain material. So that's why you have to be careful. If they start high, then they don't have any place to show that they have grown. If the assessment is not off level, advanced, and conceptually complex. That's why looking at product assessment can be so powerful, because it gets at some of those issues. You're able to see through the product that they've created what kind of thinking has gone on to be able to create that product. Okay. Yes?
Just went through this this fall. I'm the supervisor of a tag program, and we did not before have any kind of progress report or anything for our elementary program that goes home and at least lets the parents know how their child's doing. And in looking at this, it is very, very hard to assess student progress in a tag program because of the things that you're asking them to do. It's more of giving them enrichment, getting them to think in different and expansive ways, and a lot of that kind of stuff is more difficult to really in concrete ways assess.
You have to do the best you can. Creative thinking. How do you know that a kid is using creative thinking? Well, if you look at a product, what's the evidence that he's looked at fluency, flexibility, elaboration, and how original is the product? Okay, those are some criteria to look at creative thinking. Is critical thinking gone into the nature of the product? Has there been a way of looking at the problem and defining the problem? Has there been a good review of existing information about that topic? And has he looked at multiple sources for that? Has he looked on the web? Has he talked to people who have expertise in that area? What other things like that, have gone on? So I think there are ways of getting at these higher level skills, and we just have to start, transforming our thinking into ways that we can find that out. Things like videotaping presentations of students and having a panel of experts, not you, but a panel of experts in that area, judge the quality of what the student has done. It's sort of the preparation for a science fair, idea. It's a science fair idea, but can be used at any grade level to get a feel for student products and the power of or the ability of the student to articulate his ideas once they in fact have been put into a particular product. So I think we have to become more socialized to using these kinds of tools. You're right that it's difficult, and part of what makes it difficult is that we have to think it through carefully, we have to pilot it first, and then we have to employ it and implement it successfully across the board. If I were to say the one place in American education, and I've done a lot of evaluations in Singapore, as well as other countries around the world, predominantly Singapore, it's the #1 country in the world in terms of gifted education, in my view, in terms of what they've been able to do with this kind of process. They implement very successfully. We don't. They train very successfully. We don't. We did a study of specialized schools, high schools in the United States. Our specialized schools versus specialized schools in Singapore. Singapore outperformed us in every single variable related to teacher preparation as well as student performance. Now, we were high, but they were also significantly higher. Why was that? When we tracked it back, what we saw was an imperfect implementation system. We didn't insist that every specialized teacher who works with gifted learners had a background in gifted education. In Singapore, they can't work with them, even if they're PhD scientists, if they haven't gone through 12 hours of gifted education, because they need to understand some of the developmental issues that Sylvia was talking about this morning, some of the social emotional issues. So the training is an important part of it that made the difference. 65% of specialized teachers in this country are trained, 100% in Singapore. Okay, they're all secondary teachers. How many of you are high school people here? Okay, you're good. Yeah, I can tell you're in the minority in this group. We don't get a lot of high school teachers necessarily interested in going through gifted education coursework. Why? Because they have the specialty in their own subject area. They may have worked with gifted students for years, so they have experience. They know a specialized program like AP and they can implement it successfully, but there's still a missing piece, okay? And so the lesson, I guess, is that the implementation is critical. And the implementation, not just of what you have as your goals for your kids, but the implementation of a staff development or professional learning program that will be the right match for them, what teachers need to be able to implement it, okay? And that means change. Remember my first slide this morning was not about status quo, it was about change. And that's, again, one of the kinds of positive directions, I think, that most of our gifted programs can benefit from in terms of bringing in more appropriate assessment tools. Okay, let's go on. So what works? What have we found over all these 10 years of evaluations, 6 different states, in fairly strong gifted programs? Planning carefully through asking the right questions to a broad array of stakeholders. That's the #1 lesson takeaway from what I've said so far. Using multiple tools for assessing student learning. We've talked about that from the standpoint of using qualitative and qualitative approaches. Finding ways to include student product data in a systematic way as opposed to not. Third, using multiple data sources that can be triangulated. We didn't talk about this, but what that means is you want to be sure that you have at least 2 data sources, preferably 3, of that list of 6, that in fact are dovetailing in some way in terms of what they're telling you about the program. That perceptions of the program are positive, your learning outcomes for students are positive, and you're fundamentally following the program plan, what you said you were going to do with gifted students. Those 3 things coming together is a powerful statement about how strong a gifted program is. And if it's not strong in all 3 areas or perceived that way, then you probably need to take a look. The last is using validated instruments where possible and then creating the rest. I said start with the existing tools that are out there. If you want to look at kids becoming better in doing experimental design, there's a test called the Fowler test, F-O-W-L-E-R, that can be used from primary ages right up through high school. And I've used it at all of those levels with gifted kids in the science areas. It looks at scientific inquiry, and it allows you, if you want to do it at primary level, then use it at intermediate, at middle school, and at high school. It gives you a feel for how students are progressing on their ability to handle scientific research and where they're falling short. Where do gifted kids fall short? They fall short in the higher level areas of the scientific research process. They have trouble with elaborating their ideas many times in terms of that the processes. They have difficulty with interpretation of data, and then they also have difficulty with not just the interpretation, but then the implications of the data for how they might be used in the real world. So the higher level functions of doing the scientific research process is typically where these students have trouble, and that's true even up at the high school level. So it isn't just at the elementary levels, it's also middle and high that those problems still persist. But it's a great tool, It's one tool, it's free. You can go online and get a copy of the Fowler. The College of William & Mary website used to carry it. I don't know if they still do or not, but it is an available tool that is no cost to you to use. It can be used pre-post, midpoint, post, and it's easy to score. The rubric is right there. That's an example of a standardized tool in a subject area that matters for gifted students. Fowler, F-O-W-L-E-R. Okay, you'll see it. It's on one of the slides. I can't remember which one in terms of the title of it anyway. But that's an example of using a validated instrument. So you don't have to go out and create your own. Use one that's already been used over and over again with gifted kids at all stages of development, and will give you usable data. Greenwich, Connecticut, for example, has used this test for the last 20 years. I've worked with that district for a long time, and found it to be useful in terms of getting at gifted students' performance at higher levels. Okay, so let's look at some of these tools a little bit more closely. I talk a lot about performance-based measures, and I just mentioned the Fowler test, but we have these pre-post measures in language arts. I mentioned writing. We also have Math Olympiad problems. That's a terrific way to get from easy to complex math problems and see what your gifted kids are capable of doing. That really allows them to go off level in terms of what they can do. And again, a readily available tool to get at some of these assessment issues of advanced students. I've mentioned advanced placement exams at secondary levels. Using some of the advanced placement exams at middle school is a really good idea. To start working on some of the harder kinds of examples that are in those exams. Retired exams are a good way to get at that, particularly in, I think, language arts and in history. It's a wonderful way. DBQ, for example, document-based questions in social studies, should be used in every elementary gifted program. It's modeling, though, on what's used in the advanced placement programs at the high school level. But it's a great tool to, again, be sure that you're asking students to do hard stuff. Giving kids quotes, rich quotes, and asking them to explicate those quotes in terms of a 10-minute write gives you a very good idea of their literary analysis skills and how it can be applied, or how they can be applied to text that is ambiguous, to text that is complex, to text that is more advanced than would be a grade level recitation. So all of those are very good tools within the individual subject areas to get at some of the things that we want to get at in terms of student growth. We also want to use informal classroom assessment data that can be collected. You know, I'm often surprised sometimes by teachers have given kind of an open-ended assignment in terms of a project, and a few kids may have interpreted it in a very different way from other kids in the classroom, and yet the nature of what they've come up with is pretty interesting. So you don't want to just throw it away because they didn't follow the model, but rather examine it in light of really what it is contributing. So use more of the creative thinking characteristics or criteria to make judgments about what that particular project might be about. We've talked about student products. Off-level standardized assessments we've talked about also. Critical thinking tests, for example, can be used and thought of as a good tool for off-level. Even regular achievement tests or aptitude tests, if they're used off-level, can give you more information about the capability of a student. We've used those as a way to get at these issues of how well gifted students are doing in the gifted program. Now, do you have to do all of these things? No, but I think you need to pick out not one, but probably at least two of these approaches to think about inaugurating within the context of making judgments about how your students are growing on the goals and outcomes that you've established for your gifted program. So if your gifted program is predominantly in math and predominantly in language arts, which most of them at the elementary level tend to be, and tend to be even in those two subjects when the kids matriculate to middle school, and then it broadens typically, by high school level, then those are the areas that you want to be seeking help with. Or you want to be going for the more generic outcomes, like the product outcomes that could cut across subject areas, or the critical thinking outcomes that cut across subject areas, okay? So those are some tools and some ways of thinking about that. I've included here, just so you have it, the writing assessment for persuasive writing that we use in our literature units of study, which go from kindergarten through grade 12, actually. And it's based on a study that was done in language arts in general, not in gifted per se, back in 1995. That was when the tool was created and used. We then picked it up and used it in our studies in gifted education with our curriculum. And it's been used in at least 4 of the studies that have been done in terms of that. Here's the rubric. It's a little bit hard to see from the screen, but when you get it, you'll be able to go through it, and you'll see that it's a pretty easy rubric to follow. It's based on the claim, the data or the supporting points, the elaboration, and then the conclusion, okay? And then there are criteria for each of those 4 components of the written piece. And then you judge the individual writing piece that students have done as to whether or not, how well they've done. So if you looked at this piece, this short writing piece, it was done by 5th graders in a unit on autobiographies. I'm not going to read it to you, but what would you say about the claim? Is there a claim made in terms of this piece of writing? Yes? No? Yeah, kids should say no to drugs for a lot of important reasons, okay? That's the claim, okay? Is it elaborated? Is it, well developed? No, but it is a basic claim, right? Now, are there reasons given? Is there elaboration here? Reasons for that support the nature of the claim. What can we say about the reasons? How many? The quality of them. What would you say?
There's a lot of reasons not very well developed.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Say it aloud.
Several reasons not very well developed.
Okay, how many reasons?
Four, three?
4 reasons, okay. In a well-developed piece, you'd want to see at least 3 reasons. So actually they have quantity, but they may not have quality, which is what you're suggesting. One of the things you want to look for in each of the reasons, is there an example given? Is there an illustration of what's being suggested by the reason? Is there an explanation in some way of the reason? That's the elaboration part. Not so strong, right? Okay. And what about a conclusion? Well, there's a sentence. It's the end, right? Okay. So there is a conclusion, but it's not, again, developed in any way. Okay. So this would be like a pre-assessment that you might give a student in terms of being able to write a persuasive essay. We have seen, there's a model in our units called the persuasive writing model that allows kids to really get stronger in terms of being able to write this kind of persuasive piece, no matter the nature of the text that they might be reading. And so it's a really good tool to say, can I improve students in the area of persuasive writing? One of the things we do, for example, with this model is have the kids engage in power writing. They do 10-minute in-class power writing exercises to get them used to becoming more fluent. So the issue that many gifted kids have of being, they sort of stop in terms of their ability to think enough to handle their writing. They get writing blocks and that kind of thing. The fluency in class of doing a 10-minute write can be very powerful. And particularly if you're asking them to do it using a model or a structure that has to conform to being able to do a data claim warrant kind of piece. So doing power writing and then graduating, and you don't have to, by the way, judge the power writing. You can have the kids do it in class, and you're teaching them the rubric along the way as that's going on. Then after they've had some practice, give them an assignment at home that has to use this model, and then you will grade it. But that might be after a couple of weeks, and after at least 6 trials, maybe across 2 weeks of doing 10-minute writing exercises. So it's a gradual process, but it's one that really does work. And our data on this, the use of this model and the use of this rubric to judge enhancing persuasive writing is as strong as anything that I've seen. We've done it before school boards. They've been pretty impressed with what gifted kids have been able to do. We show them the pre-assessment, then we show them the post-assessment after 10 hours of direct instruction in class. And the differences are profound, okay? For all gifted students, no. Ironically, our results on student assessments, when you're looking at gifted students, it's another bell curve. Within the gifted group, you have a bell curve result. So you will have, your high group, your mid group, and your low group, even within that. So just be aware that it's not a magic bullet, but it is a significant way to really get a handle on what the learning is at those higher levels for kids. If you use it over years, is what we suggest, that you will see it grow. We've used it across 3 years with kids, and we see that their writing has improved. You might say, well, that sounds pretty formulaic to me. No, it isn't, but it is standardized. It is standardized. Being formulaic and being standardized are not the same thing. Standardization is a psychometric process. Formulaic is a judgment that's made about the nature of the processes that are employed. And so I think we have to be careful in terms of the language that's used there and the implications for what we're doing related to this. So this is what I've seen in a preschool program as a way of assessing kids in terms of knowing how to tell time. At those age levels, you can't do group assessments. You have to do individual assessments. And so it's like looking at individual products that a student may have done. So tell in pictures and numbers what you know about telling time. Now describe your picture to me. So then the students individually describe the nature of their pictures. And I'm just going to show you 2. This is Kevin O. and his picture of time. And his description was to primarily focus on the numbers. You know, you'll see my number goes from 1 to 23, you know, because at 24, something happens, right? There's a change in terms of what the numbers represent. And he's able to say some of these things in terms of the teacher, okay? So what is the teacher to make of this drawing? Is this important in terms of understanding how Kevin understands time? I think it really is, right? What does it tell you he understands about time? 24 hours in a day. Yeah, he gets that. He gets that a clock is represented in some way, that those 24 hours he thinks it is represented by, or can be represented on a clock. Now, can it be? Yeah, not most of the clocks we have, but it could be, you know, put together that way. You could have a clock that is organized that way, but he probably hasn't seen one that's organized that way.
Military time.
He knows
Yes,
the hours.
military time. Excellent, excellent. I don't think this kid came from a military family, but I don't know that for a fact. So that would be a great piece of information to pursue. What else does this kid know about time?
He knows there's an hour hand and a minute hand.
Yes, there's a small hand and there's a large hand. And on probing, we found out he did understand hour versus minute hand in terms of how that was put together. Okay? What else does he understand? Anything?
The numbers have to
Number
go in
placement.
order.
The numbers have to go in order. Okay, good. And where the hands point to allows you to separate out the hour idea from the minute idea. He did really pretty much have that in his head. Okay? Now, this is Chelsea. Cute. Yes, that's the first thing we'll say about Chelsea's, right? And we're distracted by the cuteness. But remember, what do we want to know? What is this, in this case it happens to be a girl, what does this girl understand about time?
11 clocks. It's a buffer.
Okay, she seems to be able to replicate what she's seen on a clock, especially like a wall clock, you know? It seems to be pretty much a reasonable representation with the right numbers, the right order, with the minute hand and the hour hand, right? What doesn't she understand about time? About telling time? Or what can't you say that she understands? What don't you know about her understanding?
It's not clear if she can read a clock.
Okay.
Know what time it is.
Right. You don't really know, so you have to probe in that one-to-one session. Well, what time is this? Okay, and if I move this hand to this number and this other hand to this number, then what time would it be? And why does that make a difference? So you have it in the one-to-one probe, the capacity to find out beyond what's actually presented in the product as to what was the thinking that went on behind it, okay? So this is an example of using a one-to-one scheme of asking a student to create a product, talk about that product one-to-one, and see what in fact, you know, had been learned. We had a pilot we were doing with a unit called Planet X. It was a science unit for second grade kids. And we had some students in the classroom who are graduate students. When they went in and did the observations, they said, you know, these kids aren't ever talking. We have some kids who are definitely talking, they're understanding. It was a problem-based learning unit. But we're not sure about these other students because they're not saying a word. And so what we did was go in with a videotape and began interviewing these students. There were about 4 of them in the classroom. And what we found out was that they understood perfectly what was going on, but they just weren't verbalizing it. And they needed more time. What they told us, they needed more time to think about it before they were able to comment. So again, by using a one-to-one technique with follow-up probing questions in terms of more difficult material, you often can find out that these students know more than they are presenting, okay, for whatever set of reasons. So there's lots of reasons that this one-to-one follow-up as a part of your assessment, informal assessment, is so powerful, okay, and could be used. So student products, what constitutes meaningful work? Well, first of all, does it advance content understanding and teach higher level skills? Is the product going to go after your goals and outcomes, what you really want to see happen? That match is critical when you prepare, you know, project-based work. And then you have to think about it, well, can be group or individual. You know, starting with a group project is very good in terms of helping kids who don't have all the skill sets related to doing research or doing work on their own. The modeling in the group can be extremely helpful to them. So starting with group and then going to individual projects, I think is a really good idea. And grading those individual group projects using a rubric, again, in class, to try to make decisions. Requiring written and oral outcomes. We know from the literature, particularly in the math and science literature, that it isn't, that equally important to having written responses is having students articulate what those responses mean, okay? And so as we think about the assessment piece, we should also be thinking about how do we get the oral presentation piece, the oral probing, as well as the written piece that we have in front of us. I also think we need to think a lot more about short-term and long-term projects. Sometimes I think that too many of our projects go too long. Better to do a few that are shorter, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, rather than do, you know, one long-term project that goes for 9 weeks. And so we have a 1 9-week project, then another, then another, then another. Not so good in terms of how the real world of projects work. Most of us, in terms of our workflow, will always have a combination of short-term and long-term things. The kids in many early stages of development, you want them to get the skills down. So what's the best way of getting the skills down is to keep the pieces together in a relatively consistent way, which means having them work on a project every day, not taking days off to do it. It's very hard for a lot of gifted kids to wait a week to come back to a project and then got to rethink it and start over. A lot of time is wasted. So thinking through that is important. And then assess by rating of skills employed and the quality of the product, okay? This is an example from our language arts program at grades 2 and 3 of a product for the kids at that age. They look at the ideas of preserving memories and then choosing a point of view about the best way to do it, do some research to support their point of view, and then write a short paper giving a 2-minute, and then give a 2-minute presentation on your point of view supported by your findings. So there's a clear setting up of the nature of the focus of the project, what steps or processes they'll go through, and then the implications of that. So for both writing as well as for oral presentation. The product example evaluation that I've included for you is this one. This one we have found if in fact we're looking at research, and this is whether it's scientific research or social science research or humanities research, is a very good one to employ, because it gets at the main processes and the skills of doing research, but it also looks at how you can get better. Strengths of the project, what's good, and areas for improvement. So you're giving kids some good ideas about what they did and how good it was, but what areas they might consider in terms of improvement. We have found that this works extremely well with many research projects. So again, if you wanted to think about a common research project evaluation, this would be one you could model on. Not saying that you have to use this one per se, but it gives you a feel for how you could set it up. I have found that the ones that are the least difficult to score or to understand are the best. Because if you want several teachers to use the same one, you don't want it to be too challenging. You want it to be something that everybody can feel comfortable with and begin to utilize, which means not too many items. I think 10 is enough. And then having some kind of qualitative judgment in addition to the rating of the individual aspects of the report is a very good way to go. So those are some examples. My final point on this one, what works: assessing gifted students on off-level measures beyond state assessments, using pre-post performance-based measures, including products, and having students develop portfolios of work. Those are 3 very, very good ways to expand your student assessment ideas for gifted programs. Again, you don't have to do all of those, but probably it would be important to try to do at least 2 of them, 2 out of the 3. Some districts have tried portfolios and they don't want to go there. Their teachers don't want to go there. Okay, fine. The culture does not allow that to be an approach. So then you have to look at the other 2 as the way that you can best begin to assess how your gifted students are doing. Question? Yes?
In the evaluations that you did of the programs in the 6 states, did you find, generally speaking, that these, that their programs were project problem-based or rooted in ELA and or math?
Most of them were the latter. The better programs actually are the latter, because if programs are only product-based, then, you know, those products are all over the map. They're not helping with having kids grow in advanced content areas. So there's a problem where you only have projects as your way of evaluating or your way of delivering gifted programs. So I would say that, but that's an aside, because it was kind of irrelevant in terms of your question. Most of it was more advanced content in terms of the approach that was used, which is, I think, the best research-based way to go about building a gifted programs. Build advanced programs within content areas and design within that. I'll show you when I do the curriculum workshop, there's a whole template for designing then your product expectations within each core subject area. So it does not have to be devoid of content, because you have to start with advanced content. Otherwise, you're ignoring the very data you've collected on kids and identified them for programs, right? They're identified because they're advanced, they have advanced aptitudes in verbal, mathematical, and in some instances, nonverbal areas. Those are the data you have, okay? If that's what you know about a kid, they're significantly advanced in one or more of those areas, then your program should match that, which means your programs have to be driven from the ground up by advanced content. Every gifted program should start. Number one way to start differentiation is to find the level of the learner, okay? And the level of the learner will be advanced, which means you have to accelerate the materials, accelerate the instruction, etc. So that's why I would favor that as the initial approach. The product design drives out of that. It doesn't begin with the product design. Product design has no meaning if it's not nested in the student's capabilities and levels of learning, interests, and, you know, areas of exploration that they wish to engage in. Great question, though. Okay, so how do stakeholders react to your program? Positive, negative, neutral, have not enough information to judge. In your own programs, how would you respond? How many of you would say your stakeholder groups see your program as positive? Okay, we have a few. Very good. How many think your stakeholders see it as negative? Nobody. How many think it's neutral? Some would think it was good, some would think it wasn't so good. Okay, mixed bag. All right, and how many would say, I just don't have enough information to judge? Okay, it's this latter group that I think, in terms of using focus groups and some of the approaches to getting at stakeholder reactions, that group is really important. If generally you think your stakeholders are pretty much positive about your program, you know, you don't have to do an intensive kind of survey or stakeholder focus groups. You could just do maybe a couple stakeholder groups and see, take the temperature. You know, are you right or are you wrong? But the ones you want to be worried about is if they're negative or if you don't really know, okay? That's where it becomes extremely important to collect the information related to that, to the perception. Well, what are stakeholder groups? What are they good for? I think they're good for really getting a handle on getting deeper into an understanding of an issue. Like identification, going back to your point. What's going on in the identification system and how do stakeholders view it? So you've had a group of diverse stakeholders who see the identification process very differently. The generalizations that come out of these evaluation studies, 10-year evaluation studies, suggest that most focus groups in most of the school districts saw the evaluation in two very different ways, or the identification. One group saw it as too liberal, and one group saw it as too conservative. And that did not vary across these districts in every single one of them. That was the conclusion that was reached. So the focus groups were useful in determining that your identification issues were never going to be consensual in terms of the nature of the focus group data that you were collecting in that district. Never going to be, at least within that particular time frame. So then the question becomes, well, what do you do about that? You know, is there a way to change the minds of some people to move in one direction or the other? And these were districts that were doing a good job, by the way. They were using the research-based tools that are in the literature as to what ought to go into an identification of students from underrepresented groups. And that made some people mad. The parents of kids who were high on traditional measures thought that it was a waste of time, what was going on in terms of trying to find more underrepresented groups. The people in underrepresented groups felt there wasn't enough effort put into the nature of finding those kids, and particularly efforts related to using more non-traditional tools beyond testing. So you weren't going to change minds, but at least you found out through the focus group mechanism that this was a no-win kind of situation, that you couldn't satisfy everybody in terms of whatever direction you took, whether you didn't change anything or whether you changed it in one direction or you changed it in another direction. You were going to have a group that was going to be relatively unhappy. So you have to always, I think what's important here is to not necessarily be able to resolve that, but to say, we know we have this problem, you know, and we know we need to be paying attention to it. And this is what our people are telling us, and this is now how we're going to try to address it. So you have more information on which to be then making decisions, and you can share that information with others so they too can have input into how those changes might be made, which is better than not having the information to begin with. I've included a process so you can kind of get a feel for what, you know, how you should organize focus groups. Focus groups can often be organized in-house in your, you know, school district, and sometimes training a team on your, say, your advisory board to do focus groups, and then having different people ultimately be trained as facilitators that can go around and do some of the data collection. Depending on who they are, you want to be careful that you're not creating any bias through who you're choosing as facilitator. If you're hiring somebody outside, then you don't have to worry about the bias piece, but internally sometimes that can be a problem, although it doesn't have to be. I mean, you can sometimes come up with good people. So I've included some sample questions here just to give you started as to the kinds of questions you can ask focus groups. And one of the things that's really important is that you want to ask each focus group the same questions. So if it's a student focus group, for example, what is your perception of your gifted program? If it's a parent focus group, what is your perception of your child's gifted program? Or if it's a teacher, what is your perception of the gifted program? Okay, see how that changes? That's the easiest example I could show you, but those are the changes that are fine within questions, but you want the basic question to still be asked of each focus group. Why? So that when you get all the data back, you can really see not only is where a given focus group stands, but how does it compare to all the other focus groups? So is there a commonality, or is there a lot of difference in terms of their perceptions on a given question? So that's extremely useful kinds of data to get. So here's an example of triangulation of focus group data. You've got the themes that are derived on the left, the group representation in the middle, and then the percentage of that group, of each group, in terms of who came out with this as a central idea. So the first one is the identification has been improved where a larger sample population was identified as gifted students, okay? And how did we get those data? We got them from regular classroom teachers, from students, from administrators, from the gifted teachers of the gifted, and from parents. All those focus groups, fundamentally, 100%, said that that had happened. Well, that's a really positive generalization in terms of what's happening with your identification. It's coming from all different places. The identification procedure is problematic in that certain populations are disadvantaged, including students who are not good test takers, but are very bright, ESL students, and twice exceptional students. This was an agreement, not all of the same data sources, where you had 4 data sources, and 80% of each of those data sources supported that generalization as well, which suggested that the identification process was a little more problematic. And then the last one, the broader inclusion of a diverse range of students makes the differentiation difficult, resulting in regular classroom teachers. So your whole teaching group, your whole educator group, had that as a generalization in terms of their thinking, although not at quite the same broad consensus as you saw with the other 2. But you see how your data, your qualitative data, then can be looked at in a more quantitative way in terms of which groups are saying these things, where the theme can be extracted, and then how strong are they in terms of these statements. And that gives you a good feel, overall feel, qualitatively, for how something like identification may or may not be working in the context of your school district. Everybody with me? Okay. We like to build these charts for each of the major focus group questions, and then look at, across the focus groups, what's going on, what generalizations can be derived, and how do they stand up across, the different groups. Okay? Any questions about that? Yeah, takes some time, but it's a useful kind of tool and a useful way to disaggregate the data, but also to compress it into a meaningful whole. Yes?
Were the focus groups, were the questions asked pencil and paper or discussion?
Both.
Okay.
Both. If you look back to the focus group protocol, the facilitator passes out 3x5 cards, and every focus group member responds on a 3x5 card to every question. Then there is a discussion of that question, for as long as people want to discuss it. And then the second facilitator in the room, it has a running marker, using a marker on paper that's on the board, what the discussion, to follow the discussion, the ideas that come out, okay? So then at the end, the evaluator takes the sheets and takes the cards and does an analysis of each. So everybody in the focus group is represented in the analysis, and whether it was written down or whether it was oral. What it does is keep some people from dominating a focus group by merely talking a lot. You want to discourage that anyway, but this way you've got a way to put a check and balance on it, which is really good, I think. Okay? And so here what works. 3 focus groups, comparison of results, and then I didn't do too much with the last one. I think I have one example here to show you. The use of quotes is really good in to include from different focus groups, because sometimes a parent just nails it, gets it and nails it. It's a terrific comment. Or an administrator gets it and nails it. So you want to be sure that lively quotes are included in terms of some of the individual responses, so that people can really see this isn't just your analysis, but in fact where that analysis came from is from this kind of judgment. And here's the example of some quotes that are put in. General perceptions of the program, student perceptions, parents, GT teachers, and administrators. What would be your comment in terms of the ways that different stakeholders have responses to the general perceptions of the program? Are they consonant? Are they dissonant? Are they positive? Are they negative? How would you judge that?
Students and parents aren't on the same page. Students and parents are.
Yes. Okay. All right. They're a little bit pie in the sky in terms of thinking perhaps what the program is doing. Whereas the GT teachers are a little more realistic, perhaps, but more critical too. I mean, in terms of what they're suggesting by their comment. And the administrators recognize that what's going on, or seem to think that it's a good thing that's happening within the program in terms of the push for higher level skills and the push toward more advance of potential. So you can see that you don't have a lot of problems here, but you do have some perceptions that are probably not aligned based on the groups, okay? And so then you say, is that important to pay attention to or not? It's an open question, okay? And then the identification we've already talked about, and you can see some differences there as well as you go through it. But this is a good way to get a handle on those qualitative things. Okay, so now let's move. How are we doing on time? I haven't paid any attention lately, which is not good. Everybody have the schedule in front of them?
About
5 minutes? Okay. That's good. We're coming to the end. Classroom observation scale. I may give you a copy of this. This is our revised scale that two of the evaluators who worked with me in the last 10 years that we've been using. There's another one that's published in the literature, except for the new studies that have come out based on this scale, based on these evaluation studies. There's a whole issue, I don't think I put this in, I'm sorry. The last issue of Gifted Child Today. How many of you have access to Gifted Child Today? If you do, if you don't, just Google Gifted Child Today. The last issue is on evaluation, the whole issue. I edited the whole issue, and there are many articles in there that look at a number of the different issues that we're discussing here, including the results that we got in terms of doing classroom observations. So I think that that would be a helpful tool to take a look at. This is the tool we use when we go into review classrooms and what's going on. And they took it, when they copied it, they did a good job, because one of the first things that you want to do in the classroom observation is to do a scripting of what you see in the classroom. You don't fill out the scale right away. You rather go in and look at what's actually happening. And the categories that you're looking at are the ones that you see here. The first one, not a differentiation category necessarily, something you want to have happen for all kids in all classrooms, related to curriculum planning and delivery. But then you start getting into how are we differentiating for the gifted. And each of those other categories relates to certain indicators of differentiation. The scale in front of you, you're going to take with you, and I suggest you can use it in a number of different ways. For those of you who are teachers in this audience, I would self-assess. I would look at this and say, how am I doing with these, okay? Am I using them, and how regularly am I using them? One of the things, the underpinnings of this scale is that every teacher should be using higher level thinking every day in the classroom. It's not something you do on Fridays. It's not something you do a couple times a week. Every day. It ought to be built into your overall routine of teaching. So when you look at yourself on this scale, that's what effective would be in terms of rating yourself relative to many of these things. That just gives you a little bit of background. There's more there as to how you might do it. What did we find? What did our classroom observation data suggest? Majority of thinking skills strategies, which are the real markers of differentiated practice, were not present in a majority of the classrooms observed. This was a finding I was not happy to see. These are districts that are strong districts, okay? But like all districts, they have trouble with uniform implementation. The standardization of the implementation pattern makes it difficult for them to ensure that all teachers are trained to the appropriate level, that all teachers are using these things, because there's often no monitoring system in place. So that becomes a real problem, okay? The second, over half of the classrooms did engage students in some very specific critical thinking skills. Evaluating situations, the inquiry process itself, and the analysis of text, models, and symbols. We saw up to 68% of these classrooms using those specific subcategories of critical thinking. So again, when you use this scale, you can kind of figure out what skills are being used, what skills aren't being used, and what does that mean in terms of then what you want to focus on for professional development. Of greatest concern was the relatively low percentage of higher level thinking in observed classrooms. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is that where teachers were using these skills, the differences in effectiveness were minimal, okay? Were minimal. So if you have teachers who are actually doing higher level thinking, then you're in a terrific position in terms of being able to show how they might improve. Middle school teachers were least likely to employ the observed behaviors. High school, the most. Elementary, second, but middle school teachers last. Math teachers were the most likely to observe higher level thinking, followed by language arts, and less so in terms of the other two areas. The other two areas were difficult because there were so few programs. So it was really unfair to comment too strongly in terms of those other two. But that, I think, gives you, again, it's counterintuitive. We often think that more is going on probably in language arts classrooms that's higher level than not, but in fact, it's in the math classroom. The teacher behaviors are more closely linked to higher level thinking. And then the majority of teachers were employing these strategies at a somewhat effective level. That means a 2 out of a 3 on this scale, okay? Some of them moving toward like 2.5 and so forth on the scale. So the results were pretty good, but not perfect. So what works here? Teachers using grouping and acceleration as a bulwark for differentiation. This is absolutely critical for you guys to understand. When Sylvia mentioned this morning the need for peer interaction being one of the #1 things that kids need for social emotional support, It's true for cognitive support as well. So if you're in a district that is on this grouping issue that says we don't want to group any kids, we want all kids to have the same thing at the same time, they're going backwards 100 years. We have 100 years of research supporting the use of these two approaches with gifted learners. Now, does that mean it has to be full-time grouping? No. Does it mean it has to be the same kind of grouping all the time? No. But it means that some form of grouping has to be employed. Acceleration. I've already described that in terms of the earlier question. You got to have some advanced work as your automatic starting points in a gifted program. That's why the kids are there. The daily use of higher level thinking and teachers being trained in an array of differentiation strategies for the gifted. So they know there are different entry points for being able to do this effectively. So let's put it all together. How many minutes do I have? Not many. 2? 1? None? Okay, we're over. There's a slide here that looks at sample findings across data sources, outcome, and the process of triangulation. And you can see, when you see the slides, you'll be able to take time to read this more carefully. But it gives you a feel for how all of what I've said can come together in terms of your evaluation. There's also a map for dissemination and utilization. One of the things, in addition to not always implementing well, we don't always do well with dissemination and bring our groups along to know what the results of the data are and how we're interpreting them. Final 2 slides. What doesn't work? Using single source data, using only on-grade assessment, leaving instructional practice unmonitored, seeking evidence of daily use of higher level thinking in all classrooms. A lack of seeking, I should say lack of seeking. A lack of accelerated learning for gifted and targeted learners, and lack of effective implementation of grouping practices. This doesn't work. What we found, and this, you may not like this finding, I didn't put it up here because I didn't want to discourage groups and schools that are doing cluster grouping. But those of you who are doing cluster grouping, you better be sure you're looking at what's going on, because what we're seeing going on with cluster grouping, principals are placing the kids in a cluster group classroom, but the teachers are not implementing differentiated instruction. That is, they're not forming the instructional groups within the classroom that allows those kids to be together for a differentiated curriculum lesson. Cluster grouping demands that. Otherwise, the grouping alone without differentiated instruction does not produce learning gains, okay? That's an important understanding. And so if you want learning gains for gifted learners, then you've got to put them together in order to advance their learning. It's the only group where the research is very strong on this point. No other group, it's not good to group kids at the bottom together. We know that. The research is very clear about it. But what works for one group does not necessarily work for another group. And the gifted is a group that needs to be together for instructional time in terms of their area of strength. So that's, I think, an important understanding. I've included then a chart on what works, which kind of reviews what I've said already, and you can see that. And then the final thought is the same thought that we began with this morning. And that is, we've got to start making some of these changes, but it means we have to will the desire to do it. Nobody's going to make us do it. We don't have laws that insist that this happen. We just know that the data suggest that it should be happening. And if we have the goodwill of gifted students in mind and their learning in mind, then we will make some of these positive changes. Thanks so much for coming.